invitation to come and speak to everyone this morning. I'm going to take the discussion in a slightly different direction again, which is to tangle with some of the questions about how we might create a sociological analysis of the phenomenon of energy systems, energy markets and innovation that my colleagues have been talking about. And in doing this, I'm aware that not everyone may be that familiar in the room with sociology. I'm going to give a particular take on what sociology means in the context of a specific Edinburgh tradition, an Edinburgh school of thought, if you like. Tom Burns was the first professor of sociology at Edinburgh University, and in his inaugural lecture in 1966, he said, and I still very firmly agree with this, that it's the business of sociology. What sociology is here for is to conduct a critical debate with the public about its equipment of social institutions. So it's not simply to produce articles that come out in refereed journals. And sure as hell, when we begin to think about energy markets, we can tangle with some very major institutions and some very big equipment. And just by way of starting, I put up there a picture of the hardware of some of our technology systems and their interconnections, both in relation to the gas and electricity networks in place across Europe. So what is it that a sociology of energy markets is going to bring to the picture? Well, some very complex ideas, and I'm going to try and skip through these very lightly over the surface, but illustrating one or two of those ideas in more depth. And actually, in the last few months, what the group of us have been trying to do is to set out, to emulate the McKenzie model, if you like, to set out the 10 precepts for a material sociology of energy markets. And I'm very indebted to Donald for laying the ground, doing a lot of the groundwork in relation to a sociology of finance and financial markets and a social studies of finance, and to his work on the materiality and facticity of markets and of the ability of sociological analysis to drill down, to unpack the facts of markets, if you like, to look behind the presenting facticity of practice in energy markets. And of course, along with that, we have the tenet that knowledge is a matter of shared belief, knowledge about price, about regulatory devices, about our institutions is a matter of shared belief which may or may not be correct. I also take actors in the Kalonian kind of sense as a hybrid assembly, as complex creatures that choreograph the work of modern economies in which we are all implicated and in which we all participate. The concept of formal models, of course, being part of this, and again, looking very much to Donald's work and to Barnes, of course, Barry Barnes's work, the potential for both performative in a strong sense and counter-performative effects of those formalized models, particularly the models of the economic sciences in energy markets, which we hit up against in trying to do the more ethnographic and sociologically informed research that we're trying to do. And the example that I'm going to focus on more this morning, fairly briefly I hope, is the issue of evaluation practices, which has attracted enormous attention in sociology over the last decade or so through people like Jens Beckert, as well as the more Kalonian and Latourian schools of thought, and which Ronan also referred to. That idea that behind what we often take for granted as facts about price, for instance, sit a whole series of different ways of understanding, of calculating, of making price a hard material fact, which then has consequences for the kinds of energy systems which we end up with. I'm also going to talk a little bit about those practices, not simply being about the production of standards and of equivalences and commensurability between different kinds of infrastructure and energy systems in the way that Dave Hawkey referred to somewhat, but also those valuations as being multiply cultural, and I'll come back a little bit to that later. Just to unpack the idea of materiality, because often when people say, well, it's a material sociology, you go, well, it's just a label, isn't it? So materiality in a sociological sense is multi-dimensional. It's both the hardware, if you like, of energy systems that I put up a picture of at the start, but it's also the software, of course, on which we're increasingly reliant of digital data, capture, storage, processing. But also I would want to insert into that equation the complex organizations of business, state, and civil domains with their differential resources and repertoires that they bring to the picture. And one cannot work in the energy field for very long as a social scientist without being very powerfully aware of the ways that major businesses in the energy sector in the UK shape what it's possible to ask and what kinds of answers it's possible to get in a very powerful fashion. And of course behind that, and inevitably at the base, the people with their particular strengths and weaknesses, specialist knowledge, the preconceptions that come from specialist knowledge, the inevitable partiality of what we know about highly complex systems. And by way of illustration of that picture, I put up just the diagram which represents the cognitive map of one of the civil servants in the UK's Department of Energy and Climate Change, who is trying to get to grips in his own specialist role with how to insert different kinds of energy technologies into the existing system, particularly those concerned with the mesoscale, if you like. And here he's put them at the distribution box. He sort of situated them somewhere in the domain of distribution, which is how do you put mesoscale generation, combined heat and power, heat networks, locally integrated systems, storage, into this very systematized picture that is imposed on that through the instruments of the Department of Energy and Climate Change. And his term for this was the conceptual straitjacket. And interestingly, into that conceptual straitjacket, in Europe and in the UK, what we have is the insertion of contested and differential valuations of sustainable heat, which is where we come into this picture with the heat and the city research. Perhaps unwittingly, 5 years ago, in coming up with a research proposal that said, hang on, as someone who rather feels the cold, seems to me that there's a big hole in much of the way that energy policy and innovation is conceived in the UK, and that hole is to do with heat and warmth, the provision of warmth, for which we use a huge proportion. The end use of energy is very much about heat, and of course our energy system tends to be conceived top down from the production side, not the user end. So this is coming to it very much in a sociological term from the other end of the picture, from much more the user's perspective. And in that context, we see the ways in which heat is constructed and its valuation appraised. We have instruments like the EC Energy Roadmap, which comes up with 6 strategies for 80% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions from energy by 2050. Each of those 6 strategies centralize the notion of electrification of heat, primarily heat pumps, plus obviously efficiencies. No scenario in that device sees distributed energy as part of the picture. Heat Roadmap Europe, starting from a different view, of course, starting from a view that heat is a significant end use, starting from the view of the industry of heat producers and providers to some extent, comes up with a rather different picture. starting at the other end, says, well, there's alternatives here, tries to insert into this debate an alternative heat network, district heating, mesoscale solution for the decarbonisation of energy, not just heat, arguing that comes in at a lower overall cost because of the balancing and systemic contribution of mesoscale energy through heat networks. What about the UK context again? A curious and sociologically complex analysis of the valuation and appraisal of solutions for decarbonising energy in the UK. The coalition government, citing I think the same carbon plan document that Chris Huhn's foreword was in, which Mark cited in 2011. So this is the current position of the UK government. Rather than picking a winning technology, the government will create markets that enable competing low carbon technologies to win the largest market share as the pace of change accelerates in the 2020s. And around that time, in fact, John Kay, financial economist and commentator, this is actually an extract from one of his pieces in the Financial Times from 2009, predating this then says, the age of efficiency is already dead, and is suggesting that behind that statement, that positioning of an appraisal of how the race will be won in the UK energy markets is an ideological commitment to encourage this confusion, which I think he sums up rather nicely, between the concept of market efficiency as a hypothesis about the way markets respond to information and the wider assertion, which is very powerful in that statement in the carbon plan, that markets promote economic efficiency. Quite rightly, I think Kay distinguishes between those two perspectives and positions. So if we then shift to the UK government heat strategy, what does it say? Well, 2013 Department of Energy and Climate Change strategy includes in its documentary evidence valuations showing between 14 and 43% of heat demand in the UK being met economically via heat networks. The University of Edinburgh believes it, by the way. That is the University of Edinburgh digging up the Pleasance, crossing the road to connect various buildings between Holyrood high school yards and onwards to Old College. So the University of Edinburgh believes that heat demand is met economically via heat networks and so on, and that there are potential for further reductions. So the strong theory of efficient markets, which is displayed in the UK's carbon plan, suggests that markets will solve that problem. Markets will deliver somewhere between 14 and 43% of this economic delivery and switch to low carbon forms of heat through heat networks. They allocate resources efficiently according to laws of capital productivity. And the role of government then in DECC heat strategy from last year is to shape the market where necessary to overcome barriers. I was very pleased when I went to Birmingham a few years ago to find some of these market barriers, because I've been looking for them really intently for the last 4 or 5 years. I found them in Birmingham's Christmas market. So we know how to move them. You just lift them out the way. But that's the theory. The practice in the UK, when you go and do the ethnography, as opposed to reading the documents, looks rather different. So one quote, which I won't read the whole of, from our ethnographic material and interviews, which we have been doing for the last 3 years now, talks about the practice of efficient markets and the valuation of district energy in the context of those practices. And this is a finance consultant who had a very senior role in Barclays Equity Finance for many years, amongst other major public, kind of semi-public roles in the private sector. And as he says, talk to DRACs, talk to the big players in this market, and they'll say, what the hell would you do that for? That's completely crackers. That doesn't stack up at all. You've got to do all this bureaucratic stuff. You've got to spend a lot more money to do this. Who's taking the risks? And above all, you know, you can't blame the small players like the CHP industry for trying, but really they just don't have the ear of government. So a material sociology of markets, if we insert that into the picture, says then of that theory and practice of efficiency, that in advanced capitalism, the rules of capital allocation are not obedient to, they don't comply with, if you like, an abstract theory of efficient resource allocation, because they're contingent on some very complex negotiations between state and business actors, and that valuation then itself becomes encrypted in the devices and regulatory instruments which some of my colleagues have been talking about, and which are frequently owned by the finance sector. And there's a picture of one of them from the offices of various finance sector experts who we've interviewed during the course of our research. And the valuation then, in this context, in a sociological context of district heating, in terms of infrastructure finance to be brought to the party of funding heat networks, suggests that the risk is not in price per se, or scarce capital resource, so much of the lack of fit with standardized investment formulae and guaranteed returns on capital. And I've started to think about some of these systems as kind of market ecologies, using Andrew Abbott's terms, where none of these categories, developers are developers, councils are councils, and so on, and district heating doesn't fit any of them. It's the conceptual straitjacket, to go back to the civil servant whose cognitive map I put up there earlier. The UK government, of course, is not insensitive to this, does have its tools, its instruments, if you like, its institutions for trying to go about the work of dismantling market barriers. And I would suggest that they involve both forms of financial and cultural engineering. So this is a quote from one of our interviewees from UK low carbon investments, let's call them. They talk about leveraging private capital into the market. It's the role of this government agent, if you like, to leverage private capital into the market and then to incentivize capital recycling by processes of securitization in order to create what in other terms might be seen as a form of pyramid selling, but this is the form of modern financial engineering, which in theory, as we've seen, has huge risks, in practice has huge risks, in theory spreads the risk across, right across markets and right across the asset base. He also went on to say that the officers who do this job are selected not just because they understand those technologies of financial engineering, but because they have a kind of cultural fit with how the city works. They are fund managers who necessarily pass the reputation smell test. And therein lies a kind of cultural dimension of evaluation practice, not simply that the financial instruments themselves have that embedded cultural history in their measures and in their production of value, but also that they are insufficient in this context for a technology which itself is absent from existing energy markets, despite the fact that it's positioned in energy policy as playing a potentially critical role over the next 20 to 30 years. And what we have there is the UK Green Investment Bank as a kind of market intermediary, channeling not just financial information, but cultural information about trust and continuity, reliability through the key social networks which that instrument of the state has a route into by virtue of reputational capital, which is anchored in those shared social backgrounds, and that in theory that will in turn anchor the precariousness of the valuation of technologies that are regarded as currently of dubious merit in financial terms and in capital terms. It struck me that the GIB, the Green Investment Bank, is a kind of working as a kind of standardizer here, trying to transfer trust from the cultural to the technical modalities in order to routinize the reproduction of that value calculus that is embedded in energy policy around the mesoscale energy for heat, but is not embedded in the practice of markets as they're currently configured. But that's all very well in a sense, and one could find this kind of sociologically interesting, but harking back to my Tom Burns question, this has very serious public implications, not just for the kind of energy system we end up with, but also the price that we will pay and who is paying those prices. So here we have one informant from UK low carbon investments giving, if you like, the government's view, the government's formula is you focus on commercially viable investments, we leverage the private capital in, additionality, then we can demonstrate to the market you can make good money, private capital will follow. Equal finance expert in another sector, in the private sector, says one of the problems is actually that's increasing the total price that we will pay. It's not. And he draws another cultural analogy here with the French model, if you like. UK Green Investments is saying, well, we're going to move prudential rates to commercial levels because we're not prepared to lend unless the banks do, because it's not on market terms. So there is a rather self-sealing process of value production there, which actually costs the public, if you like, more at the end of the day, or certainly creates the potential to cost that. So, of course, is there scope for bricolage in the financial sense? Well, potentially, because we see it talked about. It's not that any of these actors, as you would imagine, none of them are ignorant of that production of knowledge, the production of techniques of value creation, assembly that I'm talking about, and indeed suspicion from investment managers like this example that, will this commercial model actually be fixed in place at the end of the day? Is it in practice more precariously established and more susceptible to contestation than its formalistic espousal through the state policy instruments suggests? And a sociology of energy markets then, just by way of trying to wrap this up, is trying to step back from the kind of functionalist analysis of market mechanisms of risk and value calculation to reveal something of the underlying contested, conflicted interests, and indeed, as Donald would say, the perpetually insecure qualities of market facts. And I quote from Carruthers and Kim there in the annual review of sociology a couple of years back, value is a contested and provisional judgment whose complexity lies beneath a surface of numbers and quantification. So that we can see that value has to be established, that there is a struggle, and indeed it's a very important period of our human civilization, if you like, to be looking at energy systems, because it's pretty clear that value is highly contested in the current period. So just to wrap up with some research questions and challenges and reflections on that, some of the work that we're trying to craft out of our different origins and disciplinary interests into this field what we're trying to do is put together questions where we think particularly we can make innovation studies intersect with economic sociology and the sociology of markets, and look at and examine what comes out of that in relation to this problem area of our future energy system, which is being powerfully societally posed to all of us at the moment. So we ask, one of the questions we're trying to engage with is in the reshaping of energy systems, what kinds of appraisal and valuation techniques are made effectual, which are the potent, which have potency, if you like, to effect change, and how is that made, how is that brought about? And then secondly, in assembling markets, questions about the assembly of markets and of changing markets, unpacking the selection environment, which I think is Ronan's term. Why and how is it that some technologies come to be made investable while others are sidelined or made high price, too high a price to engage with, despite what seems to be other evidence of their environmental and economic rationality in a different frame. There are big questions, I think, about methodologies, because I can't, I could ask till I'm blue in the face. I doubt if I would get very good access to the UK Treasury. And yet, arguably, the UK Treasury is absolutely instrumental if you're going to do an ethnography of energy markets in this way and of energy systems. There are big questions that I've encountered, certainly, around the legitimacy of the sociological perspective in this field. I never, when I'm talking to informants or asking for interviews with experts in the sector, I never use the word sociology. I wouldn't dream of it. I say I'm a social scientist. And I explain that I've worked in business schools quite often, because I find that gives you a legitimacy that you don't have if you come from a sociology department. So I will avoid that term, which is both perplexing and troubling, and also necessary to gain access. I think there's also questions for me, certainly, about the legitimacy of women in energy research. It was interesting that when I was looking for a picture of the head in hands quality of the conundrums of this, that they're virtually all men. The pictures that come up even in that sphere are men looking very serious. When you see images of women with head in hands, it looks a bit decorative. And so being taken seriously in this field, even feeling ownership of the language and feeling a legitimacy in using the language and in making it work for you, is challenging. And to go back to where I started, the public value of a social studies of energy. Does it have public value? Well, and what is that about? What constitutes the public value of work in this kind of area? Is it the classic STS question, opening up the black boxes to create more transparency, accountability, the awareness in the public of the consequentiality of decisions that are being taken now on all of our behalves for all of our futures, or to renew awareness of the different ways. One of my, I suppose, hobby horses and projects is to say we seem to have become seduced by the idea that the only way to link production and consumption in provision of energy services is through the exchange mechanism, through market mechanisms, which, yes, have very powerful and very dynamic and very positive value in many spheres, profit-oriented, expansionist. We owe a lot. I owe a lot to the quality of life I've led from the dynamism of markets and capitalist economies. There is, of course, another principle, which is redistribution, which I grew up with, the welfare state and its provisioning through a top-down model, which has been, of course, in the energy sector in the UK, fought against now since the 1970s, seen as inefficient and inadequate and high cost, too high a cost. There's also, of course, reciprocity, which has historically in societies been associated with arrangements for mutual provisioning without any necessary expansionist dynamic of profit seeking. Or what else is it? What other public value might we find? Thank you very much.